This morning we're going to be in Psalm 22, if you'll open up there with me. Psalm 22, and we are taking another look at the places in the Old Testament that give us a little taste of seeing Jesus in the New Testament. And this is another messianic prophecy that we'll take a look at. And so while we'll look at the psalm as a whole, what we're really trying to highlight are those parts of it that apply directly to Christ. In this psalm, Psalm 22, it's wonderful, it's beautiful, it's important, but it's also overshadowed by the very next psalm. We probably focus a little bit more on Psalm 23, and for good reason, but as far as seeing Christ before he would arrive on earth, this is one of the clearest places that we get to do that, and this psalm gets quoted frequently in the New Testament as well. So we're going to start by taking a look at the context like normal, and then we'll take a look at the parts of the text that apply to Christ, and make a little bit of application at the end. And so to start with, this psalm is a psalm that's attributed to David. And it has been for a very long time, so it probably is David who writes this. It's certainly similar in the style, similar in the language that's used to the other psalms that are also attributed to David. This psalm is a psalm of distress, and the author is clearly going through a rough time. And so just pick a week of David's life, and this probably applies pretty well to it. But it also will, of course, apply to Christ, but not just in a general sense. We'll see a lot of specific things. Also in the heading of the psalm, so right above the text, it says, "To the chief musician, set to the deer of the dawn," a psalm of David. This heading is not original to the text, but it's been around for more than a couple thousand years. And so these are things that were associated with the psalm that eventually got added alongside the text to try to give you a little bit of the background. It says there, "To the chief musician," that's either saying that the actual person, the chief musician, the song was kind of dedicated to them, and that they would be the head of the musical worship in the temple, or it's saying the chief musician in the figurative sense, who is the chief of all music in God himself. And so either way you want to take that. It says, "Set to Deer of the Dawn." Deer of the Dawn appears to be a tune, a melody. And so it's like saying that the ABCs is set to Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. It's the tune that's being talked about. And so they would know what that meant, even though we don't know exactly what that tune would be today. The other piece of background we can give on Psalm 22, although it is a psalm of David, it also has a historical association with Esther. And so this psalm, among the Jews, is still used even today. It's recited on the Sabbath before Purim. And so leading into the celebration of the events around the book of Esther, they use this psalm. In particular, the opening line that we'll look at, of course, pretty closely, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That phrase is also attributed to the feelings that Esther had in going before the king. And so whatever association is there, the Jews have used this with Esther for a long time. So, looking at the text then, we start again with verse 1. We start with that same phrase, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This question can be looked at in two ways. First, we want to know how David means this, and then we want to know why it's applied to Christ. But to start with, for David, obviously, he is feeling abandoned by God. He's feeling alone. And this is not the only time that this happens for David. We see this a lot in the Psalms. He'll ask questions like this, or he'll cry out, "Hear me, O Lord," or "Why are you so far from me?" is one of the phrases that's used in verse 1 here as well. Or "Do not keep silent, O Lord." But we get the idea. David is often feeling like God is not there with him, or God is not listening, or God is not protecting him in the way that he feels like he should be. And so that's what he means here. He's asking God, why have you abandoned me? Why have you let my enemies come in? And why have you let all these bad things take place? So when Christ will quote these words 1,000 years after David originally writes them here, what does Christ mean? And there's a lot of directions you could go. There's a lot of depth that you could get with this. But for now, we'll just say that he means pretty much the same thing. He's asking the same question as David. He's feeling separated from God. He's feeling abandoned by God. And he feels that, at least for that moment when he says this, that he is all alone. Skip down a little bit in the text here, down to verse 6. Verse 6 starts out saying, "But I am a worm and no man, a reproach of men and despised by a people, and all those who see me ridicule me. And they shoot out the lip and they shake the head, saying that he trusted in the Lord. Let him rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him." Okay. With verse 6 and 7, even though that first phrase sounds kind of strange, I think we can fairly say that it also applies to Christ. Now, again, it sounds almost wrong to say that we can apply a word or a phrase that says, "I am a worm and no man," to Christ the Savior. But when we say these words, when David says these words, they are figurative, of course. And he's talking about the way in which he feels. It's kind of the same as whenever the spies go into the land of Canaan and they say that we are like grasshoppers in our own eyes. They're saying this is how big we feel. And David says, with everything going on, you know what I feel like? I feel like I'm a worm. I feel like nothing. And I feel like I'm just at the whim of every person who comes by, that they'll stomp on me, that's the kind of trouble he places himself in. So Christ, though, the same thing could be said, that he's a reproach of men. He's despised by the people. All the people who see him ridicule him. And especially as we get to the cross, these words start to apply all the more so. So that's verses 6 and 7. We get to still in verse 7. It says there that they shoot out the lip, they shake the head, saying this phrase in verse 8, but they shake the head. Something that you can see in this psalm is a parallel to what's going on as Christ is at the cross. And so one of the direct parallels here from Matthew chapter 27 and verse 39. Here it says that they shake the head. In Matthew 27:39 it says, "And those who passed by blasphemed him, wagging their heads." Now in both cases, in Hebrew and Greek, the word's not that specific. It just means to move your head one way or another. And so don't get hung up on wagging versus shaking your head. It means the same thing. They're doing the same action. And so what we're saying is 1,000 years apart, David says, this is how I feel, this is what's going on. But we look at Christ and the same literal thing is happening to him. The same head motion is happening for the people that see him and are actively ridiculing him. Now in verse 8. In verse 8, he trusted in the Lord, let him rescue him, let him deliver him, since he delights in him. One thing we might point out in verse 8, that's a lot of pronouns. So if we want to kind of fill that in verse 8 it says that he, which is either David writing in the third person or referring to Christ, but we'll use Christ here. Christ trusted in the Father. Let the Father rescue Christ. Let the Father deliver Christ, since Christ delights in the Father. I know that's a lot to fill in there, but that's the meaning that we're trying to get across. In general, verse 8 here is speaking vaguely about someone who's in distress and that they can trust in God. And all of that's good and fine. But if we get a little bit more specific, we go back to Matthew 27 and we go to verse 43. In Matthew 27, verse 43, the chief priests say of Christ, he trusted in God, let him deliver him. Now if he will have him, for he said, I am the Son of God. But again, the phrase in verse 8, he trusted in the Lord, let him rescue him, let him deliver him. And from Matthew 27, verse 43, he trusted in God, let him deliver him. Those words are not accidental. Those words are, interestingly enough though, one being written by David in the Psalms, but then being spoken by the people who were trying to kill Christ. So you have the same words being said by the inspired writer, and then being spoken by someone who is not inspired, really, and yet they quote the same thing, it would seem, without meaning to. So we look at that and we say, what of the orchestration of God, where he's able to take the mouths of people who hate his son so much that would kill him, and yet for them to speak unwittingly the words that he spoke 1,000 years before. In verse 9, it says, "But you are he who took me out of the womb. You made me trust while on my mother's breast. And I was cast upon you from birth, and from my mother's womb you have been my God. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, for there is none to help." A couple things we can say in these verses. One, when you look at this and compare it to Psalm 51, this is a total side note here. In Psalm 51, we know the phrase that says, I've been sinful from birth, and from my mother's womb where I was born in iniquity. We remember those lines, but here David says the opposite. Here he says that I've always trusted in you, and you've always been my God since I was born. And so, just as the other is not quite literal, so this is not quite literal either. But David is saying that it's as if I've always been made to trust in you. But as far as Christ is concerned, these words do apply to him. Because while Christ always certainly trusted in God, he always trusted in the Father, when he became a human, that trust is entirely different. That dependence, that reliance on God. So when it says this phrase that you have been my God, but in verse 9, you made me trust. For the first time, Christ is now having to trust in God to provide everything for him. And from the time that he's a child born into this world, he's learning to trust and depend on God in a totally new way, a totally helpless way. In verse 12, it says, "Many bulls have surrounded me. Strong bulls of Bashan have encircled me. They gape at me with their mouths like a raging and roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it has melted within me. And my strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue clings to the roof of my mouth, and you have brought me to the dust of death." Again, this describes somebody in some kind of distress, but it's a little bit more specific to say that this kind of distress is a couple things. One, it is, in the view of the psalmist, inescapable. He is surrounded on all sides. There's no getting away from what is happening. And so again, you take that to Christ and say, was this avoidable? If the cup could pass from him, right? But it couldn't. And so he was encircled, he was surrounded, there was no way out. Obviously, there's a lot of overwhelming emotions here, but at the end of verse 15, he says, "You've brought me to the dust of death." The psalmist is writing as if he's at the point of death. And as we apply this to Christ, Christ is at the point of death. But we get more specific in the next few verses there. Verse 16, "The dogs have surrounded me, the congregation of the wicked has enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet, and I count all my bones, and they look and stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." And so here are two more examples that are inexplicable of a psalmist writing, of David writing 1,000 years before Christ would come to the earth, and talking about his distress in a sense, and yet saying things that make almost no sense until Christ dies in the way that he does. So the two specifics here is that they pierced my hands and my feet. Now, that is an oddly specific way to illustrate your pain, right? If you and I were in some major kind of distress and we were trying to describe it to somebody else, that wouldn't be the first or the second or the 50th thing that would come to mind. And so why is it that David here uses that language? "But my hands and my feet they've pierced." And then also in verse 18, "They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." And again, you go to the New Testament to Matthew 27 once more, to verse 35. That's exactly what happens to fulfill this very prophecy. But if David writes that about his own distress, again, how strange is that to say, I'm in such distress that people are trying to gamble for my clothing. It doesn't make sense until Christ comes into the picture and the events of his life happen. And so the rest of this psalm, verses 19 through, the end of the chapter, but let's read a little bit. In verse 19 it says, "But you, O Lord, do not be far from me. O my strength, hasten to help me. Deliver me from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dog, the one talked about earlier. Save me from the lion's mouth and from the horns of the wild oxen. You have answered me. The first part of this psalm, the structure of this psalm goes like this. The first part of the psalm, verses 1 through 18, that's describing the distress that the writer is under. Verses 19 through 21 are the plea for help, and then the rest of the psalm is the rejoicing at the deliverance that the psalmist has received. So that's kind of the structure. But what that means for us is we'll kind of leave the rest of the psalm alone. But in these verses here, as David writes for help from God, as he pleads and prays for help from God, he says, you have answered me. And so this is where maybe the messianic part of this breaks down a little bit, because while Christ did pray to God, and while God even heard him, as it will say a little bit later in this psalm in verse 24, he was not answered in a favorable way. David evidently was delivered from whatever his distress was, but Christ could not be. And so all of these awful things that are being said, all the awful and terrible feelings that David had, that he was then able to be delivered from, all those things Christ was not delivered from. He endured them until the end. The rest of this psalm is still messianic, even though there are fewer references maybe in the rest of it than in the first part. You look at verse 22, for example. It says, I will declare your name to my brethren. In the midst of the assembly, I will praise you. We've looked at that somewhat recently in the book of Hebrews in chapter 2, verse 12. That song gets quoted and applied to Christ. As I just mentioned, verse 24 says at the end of that verse that he has not hidden his face from me, but when he cried to him, he heard. Again, probably a reference to Christ as he would pray in the garden. God did hear, the Father did hear, but he didn't answer in a favorable way. So that's the psalm as far as the text is concerned. So what do we take from that? Just a few quick things. One, we'll ask it in this way, a question. What are the odds, when we're talking about the evidence for this being about the Christ, but written 1,000 years before he would be born, what are the odds that someone would write these things that could apply so directly to any individual, especially the Son of God? And I don't know exactly what the odds are if you were to give them, but I was thinking, this has been just a few weeks ago. Olivia and I were in Richmond, and we went to Hobby Lobby, okay? We ran into someone that we know from the congregation in Irvin, okay? Well, Richmond's in between Irvin and Lancaster, and so the odds of us both being in Richmond at the same time, Olivia and I and this other individual, what are the odds of that? Pretty decent on a random Thursday, I guess. What are the odds of us both being at Hobby Lobby during the same 24-hour period or 12-hour period? Not as good. What are the odds of us being there within the same half hour that we're both in the store? Not very likely at all. And what are the odds of us ever seeing each other in the same aisle? See, the thing is, I probably hadn't been to the Hobby Lobby in Richmond in 3 or 4 years. And so what are the odds of that happening? They're pretty low, but not extraordinary to the point of disbelief that that could happen. What are the odds that somebody writes something and 1,000 years later, these exact events take place in that person's life? We're not talking about the same day. We're not talking about a couple cities apart and the odds of somebody meeting each other there. What are the odds of this happening? Because it's just not possible unless God is the one that's orchestrating these things. In the first line of this psalm, when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? If someone wanted to, and this is just for the sake of argument, if someone wanted to pretend that they were the Messiah, then they could choose to quote that verse. Even in their dying moments, they could choose to quote that verse and make it seem like they're something special. But that doesn't explain the rest of it. Even if they did, even if they would choose to quote something that extreme, they can't choose what happens to them. They can't choose that their hands and their feet would be pierced in this manner of execution, which wasn't really something that they did at the time of David, mind you. They can't choose that people will say certain things about them. That they'll say if God, or let him trust in God that he would deliver him. They can't choose that someone else will say that. They can't choose that people will shake their heads at them. They can't choose that they will divide their garments among them and gamble for their clothing. They can't choose any of that. And yet all of that happens. And so what are the odds of that taking place? Not to mention, what are the odds of being born in a certain city, of being born after your birth being announced by angels? What are the odds of being born of a virgin? Put all of those things aside and just say from this psalm, what are the odds that these things could happen if this person was not in fact the Messiah that had been prophesied about beforehand? So is the best explanation for these events just chance? Just coincidence? Or is the best explanation that there's someone, some author, some planner that is behind this from start to finish? In that first phrase again, why have you forsaken me? We understand that when Christ goes to the cross, that at least for a time, he is farther apart from the Father than any other time and than any of us ever have been. And we won't get too deep into any theological arguments of what exactly was going on there. But if Christ is forsaken by God, if he is separated from God, then he's experiencing what we would see as the very definition of hell. To be separated from God and from his love. Christ knew that one day he would be forced to quote this psalm. He knew that when he was still in heaven. He knew that when he was 12 years old in the temple. He knew that in the garden. And he knew it as he said the words from the cross. That his whole life was building to this point where God would forsake him so that he could afterwards reconcile all people to himself. But Christ knew. And yet he came anyway, and he suffered anyway, and he did all of it. And why? Well, because the same reason that we give in the song that we sing, because he loved me so. Because of that, though, God does not abandon us. Because of that, God does not forsake us. God's not going to leave us, because instead he left his own son for just a little while so that we wouldn't have to experience the same thing. Our relationship can be strained. It can be made separated by our sinning. And it can be like in verse 1, why are you so far from helping me? I certainly can make myself far from God if I want, but God is still near to me if I'll draw back to him. This morning we have the same opportunity of deliverance as the writer of this psalm had. And we have even more opportunity actually for deliverance because the psalmist writes before these events of Christ's life and we are after these events, which means that he has already done the work of reconciliation. He's already been forsaken so that we don't have to be. And this morning, if you need to respond to the love of God as we're able to see it in the life of Christ, this is your opportunity to make that response. If there's any need that you have that we can address, we ask that you come forward now as we stand, as we sing.